Welcome to FCNYC. My name is Ben Chan and I do the Punch Down with Aris Pina. He was up at the Boxing Hall of Fame induction ceremony this past weekend, and next week he'll be back to regale us with tales of hanging out with Tommy Hearns and the other Hall of Fame inductees. But we've got a lot of boxing to get to. We've got a controversial decision that I'm sure that you've all heard about. But before that, let's talk about what happened on the Manny Pacquiao, Timothy Bradley Jr. undercard. And it was an okay undercard. Some disappointing, a really good comeback, and a guy who looked like he's starting to put together a real career. So let's start with Jorge Arce versus Jesus Rojas. This was a fight. Through the first round, it looked like this was going to be a barn burner. Jorge Arce knocked down Jesus Rojas in the first round, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like Rojas was the guy that everybody thought he was. He was a guy that had 20 fights, who only fought 10 guys with winning records, and it looked like he was going to be the opponent that night. But he came back in that round. Some people thought that he won the round. I personally thought that he came back just enough to make it 10-9 instead of 10-8. But then in the second round, they came out, they started fighting again, and Rojas hit Arce with a low blow, and then he hit him with a kidney punch, and then he hit him with a punch to the eardrum, all in the same sequence. Now, the punch to the eardrum was the most damaging because Arce ended up on the ground and he couldn't get back up. It seemed like he didn't have his equilibrium, that his balance was gone, and that's what happens when you get hit in the ear. You lose, your equilibrium gets all really messed up. And there are some people who think that Arce might have been faking it. I don't think so. Arce is a guy who is a blood and guts type of fighter. He's been bloodied in pretty much every single fight I've seen him in, even in the fights that he wins. So I don't think Arce is afraid to get in a real fight. And it looked like Jesus Rojas was ready to get into a fight. And I just think this was a case where Arce got fouled. He wasn't in condition to continue. So the ref and the doctors did the right thing. They stopped the fight. It was ruled a no contest. And I really hope these guys actually get in the ring and do it again. Arce said he's willing to get in the ring and do it again. Rojas, who else is he going to fight? This would be actually a really good rematch. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. That was disappointing that we didn't get to see a full fight. Now, the fight before that, we had Randall Bailey versus Mike Jones. And for the first 9 rounds, they did their best to put us all to sleep. They didn't do anything. And I put that more on Mike Jones than I do Randall Bailey, because Jones is supposed to be the guy who's the prospect. He's supposed to be the guy this was supposed to be his showcase. He's he's the Philadelphia fighter. He's supposed to show us what he can do. And for the first 9 rounds, he was afraid of Randall Bailey. Bailey, he's a veteran. He's a guy moving up from junior welterweight. He's a guy that has one punch, that right hand. If he hits you with that right hand, he will shake your world. And Mike Jones knew that, and he did his best to stay away from Randall Bailey. Unfortunately, he didn't do anything else those first few rounds. He was just kind of there, and every once in a while, he throws some pity-patter punches. It didn't seem like he was trying to hurt Bailey. It was just a really boring fight through the first 9 rounds. And then in the 10th round, Bailey landed a punch that knocked Mike Jones down. And then from there, Bailey turned it on. In the 11th round, he came up with this uppercut that just knocked Jones totally senseless, pretty much busted up his nose and in the front of his face, and that was it for Mike Jones. He couldn't get up. And so congratulations to Randall Bailey for winning a belt at welterweight. And I don't know what to say about Mike Jones. I think he's got some talent, but if he can't even take out Randall Bailey, and don't get me wrong, Bailey, congratulations to him, but the only punch he has is a right hand. If you can't figure out a way to box a guy, to outbox a guy, to out-hustle a guy who only has one punch, then I don't know where he goes from here. I mean, I know where he goes from here. He's not an elite welterweight, and maybe he can move up. Maybe he's just gonna stay at this level for the rest of his career. I don't know. It's really up to Mike Jones and his trainer to see what they want to do next. But a really great win for Randall Bailey. A shocking comeback after 9 rounds of nothing. We get 2 rounds where there's not a knockdown and a knockout. So really good story for Randall Bailey. Really good win for him. He was very emotional after the win. And congratulations to him. And we'll see what Mike Jones does next. And then on the first card of the first fight of the televised portion of the card, we had Guillermo Rigondeaux knocking down Theon Kennedy 5 times and then finally taking him out in the 5th round. Now, this is the kind of fight that we want to see Rigondeaux be in more of. We saw Theon Kennedy come in, and like I said in the preview, he's a technician. He's a guy that doesn't have a lot of punching power. For a while, it looked like Rigondeaux might let Kennedy hang around, but he didn't. He knocked him down 5 times throughout the course of the fight, and finally took him out. Good win for Rigondeaux. I wish that Donaire and Rigondeaux would lace it up and fight each other. I don't think Donaire wants to fight Rigondeaux. We'll see where Rigondeaux goes from here. But this is a guy. He is a good fighter, even though he's only has 10 victories. He's a guy. He's an elite fighter, okay? And he's a guy who I want to see, and I want to see more knockouts, and I want to see him box other guys. So let's get to the controversy. Manny Pacquiao versus Timothy Bradley Jr. Okay. Now, we know what happened. We know that the judges gave Timothy Bradley this fight, okay? We had Jerry Roth, CJ Ross, and Dwayne Ford were the 3 judges. Jerry Ross was the lone judge that scored it 115-113 Manny Pacquiao. He thought Manny Pacquiao won 7 rounds and Bradley won 5 rounds. CJ Ross and Dwayne Ford both thought that it was the other way around, that Timothy Bradley won 5 rounds and Manny Pacquiao Timothy Bradley won 7 rounds and Manny Pacquiao only won 5 rounds. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I was doing CompuBox from the fight. I was assigned to count Timothy Bradley's lands on Manny Pacquiao. Now, look at the CompuBox statistics. Pacquiao landed 253 of 751 shots. He landed 34% of his shots. Now, Timothy Bradley landed 159 of 839 punches for 19% landed rate. So while Timothy Bradley threw more punches than Pacquiao landed more punches than Bradley did. And Pacquiao landed the harder shots, and it was pretty evident through the fight. Now, was he ever in danger of knocking Timothy Bradley out? I didn't think so. I thought there were times when he stunned Timothy Bradley, but I don't think he was ever on the verge of knocking out Tim Bradley. I thought that the times where you saw Timothy Bradley look shaky and kind of fell around the ring, I thought that was more the issues with his feet than it was with his chin. Now, Timothy Bradley has a good chin, and he came in great condition, and he fought, I think, a really good fight. But I thought Pacquiao fought the better fight. Pacquiao landed the better punches. Pacquiao landed more punches than Timothy Bradley. And when I watched the fight live, when I was scoring the fight, I had it 9-3 for Manny Pacquiao. Now, when I went home and watched the fight again with the volume off, not focusing so much on what Timothy Bradley landed on Manny Pacquiao, because when I'm doing the punch zone, I'm really just watching what my fighter lands on the other guy. I'm not really watching the rest of the fight. When I went home and watched the rest of the fight, I thought, okay, fine. Maybe there are 2 more rounds, if I'm feeling charitable, that I can see swinging towards Bradley's way. So that became, okay, let me see at the end of the fight. Timothy Bradley gets 5 rounds and Manny Pacquiao gets 7 rounds. I don't know how Timothy Bradley ended up winning 5. How Timothy Bradley ended up winning 7 rounds. I don't see him winning more than 5 rounds of this fight, and I only gave him those 5 rounds. 2 of those 5 rounds I felt were being very charitable. I don't know what CJ Ross or what Dwayne Ford were watching. Now, to his credit, Dwayne Ford came out and defended his card. He felt that Timothy Bradley gave Manny Pacquiao a boxing lesson. Well, okay, a boxing lesson? I don't think anybody saw that. Okay, if judges are supposed to score a fight on 4 criteria. Now, number 1, I should mention before I say any of this, they don't see the punch statistics. So they don't see how many lands, how many missed punches, body, head lands. They don't see that. They have 4 criteria where they're supposed to judge fights on. Okay, first is effective aggression. Effective aggression means how effectively a fighter comes forward. Now, some guys are aggressive, but they're not effective, which means technically you can win a whole fight going backwards if you're more effective with your punches. And how can you win a fight going backwards? If you land more clean blows, which is the second criteria. Now, if you land, the fighter that lands the cleaner blows, that lands more of the cleaner blows throughout the course of the fight, usually wins the fight. The second is ring generalship. How the fighter moves around. Which fighter imposes his pace on this fight. Which of the fighter moves the other fighter around, okay? And the 4th criteria is defense. Now, in terms of defense, Pacquiao and Bradley both displayed pretty decent defense, I thought. They were both picking off a lot of punches, and they took their share of punches, but the punches that Pacquiao took, I thought, were mostly not clean blows, and the ones that he did take clean didn't really seem to even hurt him that much. Maybe there were a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, where I felt that he was genuinely stunned by Bradley, but other than that, I thought Pacquiao was the one that landed the cleaner blows that had Bradley stunned. And really, a lot has been said about, well, Pacquiao was unable to take out Bradley, even though he ended up with a fractured foot and a twisted ankle, and he had 2 hurt feet. Now, Bradley didn't come into this fight with a fractured foot or a twisted ankle. He ended up with those injuries because he was running away from Manny Pacquiao. He was trying to avoid getting hit by Manny Pacquiao. So whatever you say about Pacquiao not being able to take Timothy Bradley out, the reason why Timothy Bradley's feet were hurt like that was because he was trying to get away from Manny Pacquiao. This wasn't vintage Manny Pacquiao. This was not the Manny Pacquiao that was absolutely at the prime of his powers, which I thought was in 2009 when he fought Miguel Cotto, and he came at Cotto from all these just weird and crazy angles, and he just came with power, speed, and this was not that Manny Pacquiao. He came at Bradley pretty much straight, because Harold Letterman pointed out correctly that Bradley doesn't really move his head. He moves his body, and he gets in and out, but he doesn't move his head. So Pacquiao was presented with a target that he could come straight at. And so, I thought Pacquiao fairly dominated at least 7 rounds, and most people had him winning at least 9 rounds of this fight. I don't know what the judges that saw Bradley winning the fight were watching. Now, there are a lot of people who, if you watch enough boxing, you've seen bad decisions. Now, was this the worst decision I've ever seen? No, but this is certainly the worst decision I've ever seen on a grand scale. Now, when I say that it's not the worst decision I've ever seen, that's kind of like me saying, well, these judges thought that 2 + 2 = 6. Then that's not as bad as the time that I saw judges that thought 2 + 2 = 10. That's what I mean when I say it's not the worst decision I've seen. That doesn't mean I think it's right. That just means that I don't think this is the worst. I don't think this is the worst that judges have messed up the fight. Now, there was a lot of outrage from the fans. There's a lot of outrage from the boxing press, and even fighters, guys chipped in. Juan Manuel Marquez thought that Pacquiao won at least 5, had Pacquiao winning at least by 5 rounds in this fight. He thought Pacquiao took the fight. Another guy that usually doesn't speak up for Manny Pacquiao, Roger Mayweather, Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s trainer, he pointed out, I hate Pacquiao, but I thought he won that fight. Now, there are a lot of people who say, well, this is the death knell for boxing, and this is another blow to boxing. Boxing is a dying sport. I'm not sure if I go that far, because honestly, most of the people that are saying this will tune in the next time that Manny Pacquiao fights. There are some people who think that this is a conspiracy, all orchestrated by Bob Arum, because Manny Pacquiao's contract with Top Rank expires in 2013. So maybe Bob Arum thinks, well, if I fix this fight, I pretty much put a dent in Manny Pacquiao, so maybe he's less inclined to leave me, and he thinks he needs to stay with me to get the big name fights. Now, I don't know about that. I think this was just, honestly, a case of bad judging. I think the judges just totally screwed this one up. Even the one Jerry Roth that had the fight 7-5 like I had, I thought that's questionable. And ironically, Jerry Roth is the guy who thought earlier this year that Brandon Rios beat Richard Abreu, which nobody else watching that fight really thought. So take it for what it is. CJ Ross, Dwayne Ford, I have no idea what they were watching. I just think this was a case of really, really bad judging. Now, the shame of it all is that lost in this controversy is the fact that it was a pretty good fight. I thought Manny Pacquiao fought pretty well. He fought better than he did when he fought Juan Manuel Marquez. Now, part of that is because he wasn't in the ring with Juan Manuel Marquez, but his legs looked okay. Now, like I said, this isn't prime Manny Pacquiao, the Hurricane. This is Manny Pacquiao, the really, really good fighter. The guy who has a lot of power, who can move around, who can go full 12 rounds. I feel that if Manny Pacquiao was in his prime, he would have been able to take Timothy Bradley out. Now, the other part of it is that Timothy Bradley was fighting going backwards, and he did a good job of boxing, and he stayed in the fight, even though he had those 2 injured feet. Now, I give Timothy Bradley a lot of credit. I am not angry at Timothy Bradley. He had no part in scoring this fight. All he did was come into this fight in shape, and he did his best. And there were moments where I thought that he boxed pretty well, and he boxed well enough to stay on his feet through all 12 rounds versus Manny Pacquiao. And I thought he legitimately took 3 rounds in this fight. I didn't think he won the fight, but I thought he fought really well. And I give him a lot of credit for coming in there. I give him a lot of credit for fighting through those 2 foot injuries. And at the end of the day, he had nothing to do with the scoring. So I give Timothy Bradley a lot of credit. I give Manny Pacquiao a lot of credit. Now, in terms of what's going to happen next, a lot of people are saying, well, this sets up a rematch in November. Timothy Bradley thinks they're going to rematch on November 10th. In my opinion, there's no need for a rematch. Everybody knows who won this fight. Everybody who watched the fight knows who won the fight. Manny Pacquiao he didn't get angry. He didn't throw a fit after the fight. I think a lot of it is because he knows that he won the fight. And he's pretty confident that everybody else saw who won the fight, except for those 2 judges. I would actually be more interested in seeing Manny Pacquiao versus Marquez one more time for the 4th time in November. I'd rather see that fight than Timothy Bradley again. Now, if Timothy Bradley wants to fight Pacquiao again afterward, okay, fine. But, I think going for the immediate rematch actually legitimizes the 2 judges who thought that Timothy Bradley won the fight. I have no interest right now in seeing Timothy Bradley fight Manny Pacquiao again. And it's not because I'm mad at Timothy Bradley. It's not because I don't want him making another big payday. It's just I want to get the judging, the decision from this fight, that bad taste out of my mouth. And I want to see something else, okay? Now, for those of you who didn't see the fight, it will be re-airing on HBO this Saturday at 9:45. It's going to be airing right before the live card, which will feature Andy Lee versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Now, some words about that fight. Andy Lee is a fighter, in this fight is at middleweight for Chavez's belt, the same belt that Chavez refuses to put on the line versus Sergio Martinez, okay? Now, Andy Lee, he's a fighter that at the beginning of his career, a lot of people were high on him because he was a prospect. He was trained by Manny Stewart, and he looked really impressive at the beginning of his career. So impressive that people thought that this guy might be able to challenge Kelly Pavlik, who was then the middleweight champion of the world. But then Lee had some setbacks in his career. He took some losses. He took a loss to Brian Vera. Now he seems to be on the comeback. He's put some wins together, and he's challenging Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. What do we make of Andy Lee? Well, he's a boxer puncher. He's a guy, he has skills, he can box, he can go in and out. He is a southpaw, and he fights pretty well, but he has a tendency to brawl when it's not in his best interest, which is, I think, what cost him in the fight against Brian Vera. He got into a slugfest when he didn't need to get into a slugfest because I think Andy Lee is better than Brian Vera in terms of boxing skill. That's the problem with Andy Lee. Now, will that get him into trouble versus Julio Cesar Chavez? Maybe. Chavez actually is a big middleweight. He is a guy that actually tends to sweat off a lot and then put on a lot of weight before between the weigh-in and when he gets into the ring. I think he's going to be the bigger guy versus Andy Lee. He's going to try to impose his size, and Chavez Jr., he's a guy that likes to fight on the inside, and he likes to hit you to the body, and he likes to beat up your body, and he's somewhat of a rugged fighter. And is that going to be enough versus Andy Lee? Does Andy Lee have enough to beat Julio Cesar Chavez? My prediction here is I'm going to say that it's going to be an upset, somewhat. I haven't looked at the odds, but I'm pretty sure that Chavez is the favorite fighter. I'm going to say Andy Lee beats Julio Cesar Chavez. I think he can outbox him, and I think he learned from his mistakes versus Brian Vera. I think he knows that, okay, I'm not going to let this guy get on the inside. I'm not going to let him beat my body that bad. I'm going to try to tie him up when he gets inside, and I will outbox him. I think that's what's going to happen. Now, do I think it's going to be a blowout? No, I think it's probably going to be a close fight. The only misgiving I have is that if it is a close fight and it goes to the scorecards, I'm pretty sure that it's probably going to end up going to Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. just because, you know, judging boxing. And then that's another point that I want to make about boxing. You know, look, I'm angry at the judges. I'm angry at the outcome, but I'm not angry at the fighters. I mean, the fighters, they do what they can. They go into the ring, they put on their best effort, and what happens in the ring to me is beautiful. It's honest, and there's no hiding in boxing. Once you're in the ring, you're in there, you're by yourself, you're fighting the next guy. Sometimes you get screwed by a ref, but most of the time the ref stays out of the way, and the two people go at it. It's what happens outside of the ring with all the judging and the promotions and that stuff is the stuff, it's silly. You shouldn't take it seriously, but just respect what happens inside the ring. And for me, that's what it is. You know, so bad decisions will happen all the time in boxing, but always respect what the boxers do in the ring. So 9:45 on this Saturday on HBO, we have the re-airing of Pacquiao versus Bradley, if you missed it the first time, and then we have a pretty decent fight between Andy Lee versus Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Now, Chavez Jr. is supposedly signed a contract to fight Sergio Martinez. Sergio Martinez, in case you don't know, he's the baddest man on the planet at middleweight. He is the middleweight champion of the world. I don't care what kind of belt Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. holds. He is the guy that Chavez Jr. has been running from. Now, if they fought, I'm pretty confident that Martinez would knock Chavez Jr. out. They signed a contract to fight. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know whether Chavez Jr. will honor that contract, so we'll see whether that fight actually ends up happening. But in the meanwhile, Andy Lee versus Chavez Jr. It's going to be Saturday on HBO, and then before that, you get to watch Pacquiao versus Bradley. Thanks for tuning into Fight City. Take care, everybody.